Imagine, imagine being trapped in just the most brutal system of oppression you can possibly think of.
All right.
Your entire existence has been reduced to sweat, dust, and unending forced labor under a regime that basically views you as completely disposable.
Utterly disposable, yeah.
Now, imagine taking the literal dirt from that suffering, the actual byproduct of your own slavery,
Yeah.
throwing it up into the air and watching it bring that massive global superpower to its absolute knees.
It's incredible. It completely shatters the power dynamic. I mean, the oppressor is suddenly paralyzed by the very thing they used to oppress.
Right. And it's just the ultimate poetic justice. And that is exactly what we're looking at today. Welcome to our deep dive into a profoundly pivotal turning point in ancient history.
Yeah, we are unpacking the sixth plague of Egypt.
Exactly, the plague of boils, which you can find in the book of Exodus, chapter 9, verses 8 through 12. And we've got a massive stack of material in front of us today for you. We're looking at theological commentaries, historical and cultural analyses, ancient medical texts, and even some biblical sermons.
Yeah, and our mission here is really to just strip this down to the studs. We want to understand what actually happened. So we're looking at the poetic justice of how this plague started, the total catastrophic collapse of an ancient medical and religious system, and finally, the psychological point of no return for Pharaoh.
Right. We really want to look at how a single handful of soot dismantled a supposedly invincible empire. Because before we even get to the physical terror of the plague itself, and it gets pretty gross, we have to look at the weapon that was used to trigger it.
The soot.
Yeah, the soot. God instructs Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a furnace. But when you look closely at the historical context from our sources, this isn't just, random ash scooped out of a kitchen fire or something.
No, not at all. The soot specifically comes from the brick-making kilns. And to understand why that matters so much, you really have to understand the Egyptian economy of that specific era.
Which was built entirely on forced labor.
Exactly. The Israelites were trapped in this state-sponsored system of mass construction. They were pulling mud from the Nile, mixing it with chaff, and baking bricks in these massive, blistering hot kilns just to build Pharaoh's monumental store cities, places like Pithom and Ramses.
So these kilns are basically the literal engines of their enslavement. I mean, they represent generations of sweat and tears and just brutal physical trauma.
Yeah. The soot inside them is literally the residue of human suffering. So when Moses and Aaron are told to gather that specific soot, it's an incredibly loaded gesture.
It totally is. It makes me think of like a modern-day whistleblower working inside a massive, totally corrupt corporation.
Oh, yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Like when they finally decide to expose the company, they don't just file a generic lawsuit. They take the corporation's own shredded cover-up documents, painstakingly piece them back together, and use those exact documents to bring the executives down. The literal byproduct of the corruption is scooped up and weaponized against the oppressor.
And the ultimate whistleblower weapon here is the soot itself. I mean, the ashes of their affliction literally become the seed of Egypt's judgment.
Wow.
And there's also a really crucial shift in the leadership dynamic right at this moment in the text. Both Moses and Aaron are told to gather the soot, but God specifically instructs only Moses to throw it into the air right in front of Pharaoh.
Which, correct me if I'm wrong, that's a pretty big departure from the earlier plagues, right? Because before this, Aaron was usually the one stretching out his staff over the water or the dirt.
You're exactly right. Yes, Moses is stepping into a entirely new phase of leadership here. He is maturing from this, he was a reluctant messenger, really into the primary leader.
Right.
Theologically speaking, our sources note he is acting as the divine warrior here. He's taking point in the battle and actively initiating the strike on behalf of his people, right to Pharaoh's face.
I love that. So that literal dirt hits the wind, and when it lands, the narrative just shifts drastically. Up until now, the plagues have targeted the environment and the economy.
Right, the water turned to blood, the frogs invaded.
The gnats and flies ruined the land, the livestock died, and, I mean, that was devastating, sure. But as the soot lands, we see this massive, terrifying escalation. Because this is the very first time a plague directly strikes human bodies.
It crosses the terrifying threshold, it really does. The text describes the soot turning into a fine dust over the whole land, causing festering boils to break out on both humans and animals.
Festering boils. Ugh. I mean, just hearing the phrase is wince-inducing.
It's awful.
It is. And when you look at the original Hebrew words used here, I think it's shachin and ababua, it paints just a horrific picture. We are talking about hot blisters, pustules, and swelling abrasions that just burst open.
Yeah, it's not a pretty sight.
Not at all. So what was the actual biological reality of this? Like, if we looked at an Egyptian suffering from this under a modern microscope today, what are we actually seeing?
Well, medical historians do debate the exact pathology, but there are two highly plausible scenarios in our sources that fit the symptoms perfectly. The first is a massive outbreak of cutaneous anthrax.
Cutaneous, so skin anthrax.
Yes, skin anthrax. And the mechanism for how that would spread actually makes perfect sense when you look at the sequence of the previous plagues.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, think about it. The fifth plague completely wiped out the Egyptian livestock. So you had fields absolutely filled with thousands of massive decaying animal carcasses.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And anthrax spores survive in the soil and in dead tissue for a very long time. So as the Egyptians interacted with those carcasses to try and clean them up, or even as biting flies moved from the dead animals to the humans.
The flies from the earlier plagues.
Exactly. The anthrax bacteria would have transferred directly to their skin.
Which I'm assuming causes severe coal-black skin lesions that ulcerate and swell.
Yes, exactly. It's incredibly painful and dangerous. Now, the other strong medical theory from the sources is a nationwide outbreak of what are called furuncles. Yeah, which are extremely severe staphylococcal skin infections. Basically, super intense staph infections. Let's remember the environmental state of Egypt at this exact moment. The Nile had been compromised. Piles of dead frogs had literally just rotted in the sun. The insect population had exploded.
Right.
The water supply is totally contaminated, and on top of all that, you have the blistering North African heat.
So it's basically a cascading ecosystem collapse, creating the ultimate petri dish.
It is the perfect biological storm for a staph infection to rapidly accelerate into deep necrotic skin abscesses. A furuncle doesn't just sit on the surface like a normal rash. It burrows deep into the hair follicle and the subcutaneous tissue.
Ouch.
Yeah, it causes fever, systemic shock, and just excruciating localized pain.
Wow. Actually, one of the historical analyses we looked at compares the sheer physical agony of this to the biblical figure of Job.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Yeah, because Job was afflicted with such terrible festering sores that he had to sit in a pile of ashes and physically scrape his own skin with broken pieces of pottery just to endure the unrelenting itching and the pain.
It's unimaginable.
It really is. That's not just a bad rash, you know? That is a level of suffering that consumes your entire reality. You can't walk, you can't sleep, you can't think.
Right, your entire world shrinks down to the pain of your own body.
Mm.
And yet, and this is a key detail, while this biological nightmare is ravaging the Egyptian population, the Israelites living in the region of Goshen are miraculously spared.
Wow.
Their bodies remain completely clear.
Okay, wait. Physically speaking, though, how does that work? How do 2 handfuls of soot cover a massive nation like Egypt? I mean, Moses throws maybe a few cups of dust into the air. Even with a really strong wind, that doesn't add up geographically.
Doesn't add up naturally at all, and that is exactly the point. The tossing of the soot was a prophetic, symbolic catalyst. God supernaturally multiplied that dust to cover the land. And this is a really vital distinction because it completely removed Pharaoh's ability to just brush this off as a mere Mother Nature anomaly.
Right, he couldn't just tell his advisors, like, oh, the wind just kicked up some bad bacteria from the dead cows.
Right. A natural epidemic spreads outward from a point of origin over weeks or months. This was instantaneous. It was nationwide. And it completely bypassed the specific geographic area where the Israelites lived.
Which is just impossible to ignore.
Exactly. The supernatural multiplication of the dust was this blazing, undeniable signature of divine intervention.
So you have an entire nation where suddenly, out of nowhere, everyone is covered in hot, oozing blisters. And, you know, when our bodies fail and physical pain sets in, human beings inevitably turn to their doctors and their gods.
Always.
And ancient Egypt was no different, except their healthcare system and their religion were essentially the exact same thing.
Yes, heavily intertwined.
So what happens when the Egyptians try to get medical help for these boils?
Well, this is where we see the absolute strategic brilliance behind the plagues. They were not just random acts of destruction. They were highly targeted acts of spiritual warfare.
Okay.
This specific plague was a devastating surgical strike on Egypt's deities of healing.
Because the Egyptians practically had a deity for every single bodily function and disease.
They did. But the most prominent target here was Sekhmet. She was a terrifying, incredibly powerful, lion-headed goddess.
Right, I remember seeing statues of her.
Yeah, and her title was literally the Lady of Pestilence. The Egyptians believed she had the power to send plagues, but also the power to cure them. She was the one you frantically prayed to when an epidemic broke out. But during the plague of boils, Sekhmet is completely paralyzed. She does nothing.
And it wasn't just her either. You have Imhotep, who was essentially the god of medicine and the patron of physicians, and Isis, arguably the most beloved goddess, who was revered for her magic and her healing spells.
Yes. The Egyptian medical system relied really heavily on Heka, or magic. They honestly believed that by reciting specific incantations and wearing amulets, they could literally compel the gods to heal them.
Like forcing their hand.
Exactly. But none of Isis's magical words, none of Imhotep's medical wisdom, and none of their protected amulets offered a single drop of relief. The gods of healing were fundamentally exposed as powerless frauds.
Man. But the fallout goes so much deeper than just unanswered prayers, doesn't it? Because the physical nature of this plague completely destroyed the religious infrastructure of the country.
It did.
To even step foot inside a temple, an Egyptian priest had to be physically flawless. They were obsessed with ritual purity.
Obsessed is almost an understatement. The priests washed themselves in cold water twice during the day and twice during the night. They shaved their entire bodies completely bare every other day to ensure no lice or impurities could attach to them. They wore only pure linen. If a priest had so much as a small skin blemish or a rash, they were strictly forbidden from entering the temple or performing any sacred rituals. They were considered contaminated.
So wait, if every single priest in Egypt is suddenly covered from head to toe in festering, oozing boils...
They are all instantly rendered ritually unclean, highly polluted.
Oh, wow.
They are immediately disqualified from their duties.
Mm-hmm.
In the city of Memphis alone, historical records suggest there were over 1,000 temples. Because of these boils, every single one of those temples was forced to lock its doors.
1,000 temples just shut down.
Just shut down. The daily rituals, the offerings, the incantations that the Egyptians believed physically kept the sun rising and the universe from collapsing into chaos, it all just stopped.
It is the ultimate system failure. Think of the modern equivalent for us today. It would be like the entire healthcare system, the entire religious infrastructure, and the entire government apparatus of a global superpower experiencing a simultaneous, unrecoverable server crash.
A total blackout.
Right. The hospitals are locked, the churches are empty, the experts are totally silent, and the entire system is just bricked. It forces you to realize this wasn't merely a physical epidemic for Egypt. It was absolute cultural bankruptcy.
Cultural bankruptcy. That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
Everything they placed their ultimate confidence in was dismantled in an afternoon. And that total collapse brings us directly into the halls of Pharaoh's royal court.
Where the real drama is.
Exactly. While the temples are shutting down across the country, we have to look at what is happening to the elite inner circle.
Right, and the biblical text makes a very specific, almost darkly comedic observation here. It points out that Pharaoh's magicians couldn't even stand before Moses.
Because their bodies, specifically their knees and legs, were so ravaged by the boils. And think about the trajectory of these magicians for a second.
Okay.
In the earlier plagues, they were arrogant. They stepped up to compete with Moses. They used their secret arts to replicate the blood in the Nile. They replicated the frogs.
Right, they were putting on a show.
Yeah, but then, during the plague of gnats, their tricks finally failed, and they had to admit to Pharaoh that they were witnessing the finger of God.
But at least they were still in the room during that one now. They physically cannot even show up to the fight.
Exactly. They are crippled. And theologians draw a massive line here between their physical inability to stand and the ultimate spiritual inability of evil to stand in the presence of a holy God.
Oh, wow.
Our sources point out that this moment heavily foreshadows the final judgments described in the book of Revelation, specifically chapter 16, where agonizing sores break out on those who oppose God, and no one is left standing before his absolute authority.
It's just this vivid, pathetic picture of complete defeat. The magicians are on the floor, the temples are shut down, the nation is screaming in pain, and yet right here we reach the most crucial psychological and theological turning point in the entire Exodus narrative.
Yes, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart.
Yes. For the first 5 plagues, The text is very clear that Pharaoh stubbornly hardened his own heart. He actively chose to ignore the warnings.
He did.
But right here, during the sixth plague, the phrasing changes entirely. The text says, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, which honestly brings up a really tough philosophical question that people constantly wrestle with.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The classic question of free will versus divine sovereignty.
Exactly. I mean, isn't it profoundly unfair for God to harden Pharaoh's heart, essentially forcing him to be stubborn and then punish him for having a hard heart?
It seems like a paradox.
Right. If God is the one pulling the strings and making him obstinate, how is Pharaoh actually responsible for the destruction of his country? Is it like a spiritual rigor mortis? Like Pharaoh chose to freeze his heart over and over again until eventually God just permanently set the thermostat to freezing and ripped the dial off the wall.
That analogy of the thermostat hits exactly on how the historical and theological analyses explain this dynamic. To really understand it, you have to look at the Egyptian concept of the heart, or the Iba.
The Eep. Okay.
Yeah. In Egyptian mythology, the heart was the center of a person's morality. When a pharaoh died, they believed his heart would be weighed on a scale against the feather of truth and justice in the afterlife.
Oh, I've seen drawings of that scale.
Exactly. If his heart was heavy, meaning hard or burdened with sin, he failed.
So for Pharaoh to have a hard or heavy heart in this story means he is actively failing the ultimate test of a ruler.
Precisely. And it's vital to remember the sequence of events here. God did not start by hardening the heart of an innocent, compliant man. Time and time again, through the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh was given overwhelming evidence. He was given very clear warnings.
Right.
And every single time, he made the conscious, repeated, arrogant choice to harden his own heart. He chose his pride and his economy over the undeniable truth.
He set the temperature himself.
He absolutely did. So when the text says God hardened his heart during the 6th plague, it is not God overriding a good man's desire to repent. It is God confirming the stubbornness that Pharaoh had already deeply committed to.
Wow.
The commentators call it a terrifying concept, divine given-overness. God handed Pharaoh over to the absolute consequences of his own repeated choices. Pharaoh wanted the strength to resist God, so God provided him with the ultimate rigid strength to resist.
Which naturally led to his own complete destruction.
Exactly, allowing God's justice to be fully displayed.
Man. So we've unpacked the ancient economy, the medical realities of anthrax and staph, the total failure of lion-headed goddesses, and the really heavy theology of a hardened heart. But, what does this all mean for us right now?
That's the big question.
Right. We aren't ancient Egyptians, and hopefully we aren't dealing with supernatural boils anytime soon. So why should you, listening to this deep dive today, care about a handful of soot from a 3,000-year-old kiln?
Well, because while the technology changes, core human behavior simply does not. This historical event serves as a profoundly urgent warning about where we place our trust.
Yeah.
The Egyptians trusted completely in their amulets. Their advanced medical knowledge, their powerful deities, their flawless religious systems, and their untouchable political leaders. But when they were tested by ultimate reality, every single one of those amulets failed them entirely.
And we absolutely have our own amulets today.
We do. We place our deep, unshakable trust in our financial portfolios, our social status, our modern medical technology, or simply our own intellectual pride. We build these massive psychological fortresses out of these things, just assuming they will insulate us from the chaos of the world.
Right, we think we're safe.
Exactly. But this deep dive reminds us that any foundation built on something other than ultimate, unshakable truth can be dismantled in a matter of seconds.
It all burns down to soot eventually.
It really does.
Yeah.
Furthermore, it is a sobering warning about the state of our own internal lives. Think about Pharaoh. He ignored the flashing red warning signs until he crossed a psychological point of no return.
Yeah.
We have to fiercely guard against letting our own hearts become calloused by repeatedly ignoring the convictions and the clear warning signs in our own lives.
Because it is dangerously easy to ignore those first 5 warnings, right? Just convincing yourself that you're totally in control until you suddenly wake up at plague number 6, the thermostat is stuck, and you can't walk back the damage.
It forces a deep self-reflection. It asks us, what are we stubbornly clinging to, even when the evidence tells us to let go?
That is powerful. And I actually want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something we haven't explicitly discussed yet today, but that builds directly out of the cultural context of all these sources.
Okay, what is it?
Well, we talked earlier about how the Egyptian priests and the royal court were utterly obsessed with ritual purity.
Right, the shaving, the washing.
Exactly. They literally looked down on everyone else. If you had dirt on you, if you had a physical blemish, you were unclean. You were completely cut off.
They held themselves entirely above the physical suffering and the grit of the real world.
Right. And for over 400 years, the Egyptian elite had forced the Israelites to be the ultimate untouchables. They stripped them of their humanity, made them slaves, covered them in the suffocating dirt and soot of the brick kilns, and treated them as just less than human.
Yeah, utterly degraded them.
Then Moses takes the soot from those very kilns, and it lands on the pristine, perfectly shaved skin of the priests and the royalty.
Wow.
Could it be that this specific plague wasn't merely about physical punishment? Could it be that God was spiritually forcing the arrogant Egyptian elite to experience the exact same horrifying feeling of being an untouchable, a despised, polluted outcast that they had forced upon the enslaved Israelites for centuries?
Oh, that's profound.
The literal dirt of their cruelty became the very thing that permanently stripped them of their pride. Something for you to think about until next time.